Hi everyone, my name is Kat Tao. I am a developer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I'm not local to Stevens Point, but I do love it up there. So without a whole lot of ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And you'd think after so long this would get easier. All right, here we go. I'm going to share my screen. It should be boring and blank, and let's get started. So welcome everybody to my talk, which is entitled "The Internet is for Everyone." And a quick sidebar here, the slides are available on my website, cattao.dev, if you want to follow along or check them out later at home. So the internet is for everyone. This is not an original title. It originally belonged to a memo written by Vint Cerf at the turn of the century, not the 19th century, the 20th century, before written smartphones, before streaming video and music, and before apps. But it is startlingly prescient. If you haven't read it, it's a call to action and a little bit of a warning. Vint could not predict everything that would happen in the new century, much less in the first 20 years of the new century. But he knew that the growth of the internet was unstoppable. He also knew that we must be active stewards of the internet. His memo implores us as technologists and as citizens to be responsible in its use and development, and to actively work for digital equity. The world is radically different today than it was when Vint wrote his memo. A lot has changed. Technology has changed a lot. And tech can do so much more now than it could then. And for most of us here, technology is an indispensable part of our daily lives. We rely on technology for essential services, for entertainment, and to share our lives with loved ones. But not all of these technologies that we rely on work for everyone. Some technologies require fine motor skills. Some don't provide meaningful content for screen readers. Some include visual effects that make some people sick. And that makes it difficult or even impossible for some people to use some technologies. But it doesn't have to be that way. We know by now that we can create technology that is inclusive and accessible and that works for everyone. But we don't always do that. Why? Most of the time, it's because we don't actually know what we're doing. I don't mean that we're flailing around, slinging code in the dark and just hoping that it compiles, although we've all had those days. I mean that we don't always know what we don't know. It's impossible for us to create inclusive and accessible products if we don't know how people with disabilities use technology, or if we don't even realize that certain disabilities or barriers even exist. So if we truly believe that the internet is for everyone, and we want the tools and products that we make to fulfill that promise, we need to understand what everyone, quote unquote, means. Everyone doesn't look only like the people in this Zoom call. So what do we need to know? Well, this talk will first outline what we mean by disability and who might face problems using technology. We'll also cover why this matters, not just in the interest of equity, but to your business and to your shareholders. And we'll then start to talk about how you can start identifying and improving accessibility in your own work and what you can do next. A couple of housekeeping notes that I want to go over before we really dive into it. So I live and work in Milwaukee, as I said, as a software developer. Oops, excuse me, hit a button. Although I really mostly work on web apps. I mostly work in the front end. I do some back end, but pretty strictly, I work on websites and web apps. So the rest of this talk will focus a bit more on web accessibility. Some of the technology or jargon might be slightly different than what you work on, but that's just what I'm most familiar with. It's okay though, the same general principles are going to apply. If maybe you never need to use an ARIA tag with what you're working on, but the same general principles of how technology should be accessible are going to be the same, whether you are building a website or a mobile app or a desktop app or whatever. The other thing I want to cover is language. There are two primary ways in English that we can talk about disability and people: person first and identity first language. So for example, you might say a person with a disability, which is person first language, or a disabled person, which is identity first language. The correct linguistic choice between these two is always the choice that an individual or community prefers. Different people and communities have complex reasons they prefer one or over the other, and that discussion is honestly out of scope for this. This talk isn't about a specific type of disability or community, so there is no right answer. And you should remember the same thing is true when you're speaking about disability. I'll try to use both person first and identity first language and mix them in. I may favor one or the other without realizing it. The other thing to talk about is A11Y. This is a numeronym for accessibility. The letter A, 11 more letters, and a letter Y. It's most commonly used to refer specifically to, again, web accessibility. You will see A11Y, also pronounceable as ally, in links that I include on my slides and in a lot of online resources if you do your own investigation later. So, what is disability? Well, what comes to your mind when you think of it? A common image is a person with some kind of physical impairment, such as a wheelchair user. Or maybe you're reminded of so-called invisible disabilities, like deafness or learning impairments. Most people, when they think of disability, think of something like this: people in a wheelchair or who are blind or deaf. These are attributes or characteristics that people have. Needing a wheelchair is a feature of a person. This is known as the medical model of disability. In the medical mental model, people may have health conditions such as blindness or a spinal cord injury that inherently impair their abilities. This mental model assumes that the problem lies with an individual and that certain health problems are outliers that need to be treated or cured. This mental model is obviously very common, and it does have some valid uses. Medicine is the obvious one. There is total validity in developing treatments for cataracts, for example. It's important that we recognize health problems that can be alleviated with treatment or medication to improve quality of life. But, there's a big but, this model fails us when we apply it to society as a whole or to technology. When we think of these impairments as a quote-unquote problem with an individual, we're really limiting ourselves. We are making an assumption that our technology's design is correct and our individual users have the problem. It then becomes easy to see accessibility as a rare edge case that applies to only a few potential users. It's then easy to decide that accessibility isn't a priority for the product, for design, or for the development team. And those attitudes don't help us develop better products. So we need to develop a new mental model so that we can develop better products. And to do that, I'm going to ask everyone to participate in a brief exercise in imagination. If you will, imagine a world in which almost everyone you know is blind. All of your coworkers are blind. Your neighbors are all blind. Most people are blind. And in this world, since most people are blind, almost all written word is in Braille. Library books are in Braille. Restaurant menus are in Braille. Government pamphlets about essential services are in Braille, and you don't read Braille. In this world, being blind is not a disadvantage. It's the status quo. Both this imagined world and the world around us have been designed by and for people who simply fit the status quo. You, as a non-Braille reader, are at a huge disadvantage in this alternate reality. But that disadvantage isn't due to a medical condition. It's a symptom of design. The world around you didn't consider the needs of non-Braille readers, and so your ability to thrive and even survive is significantly impaired. This is known as the social model of disability. Users have unique ability and needs, and society, or in our case, technology, can either support or ignore them. When we choose to ignore the diversity of our users, we are choosing to treat those with certain impairments as abnormal, and we are responsible for unnecessarily excluding them. The physical world around us has great examples of this. Two stores may have entrances on the same street, only one has steps and one has a ramp. We can all use the ramp, but only some of us can use the stairs. The individuals who can't use stairs aren't the problem here. It's the building that was carelessly designed. So what I want you to remember is that poor design is what disables users, and good design enables all of our users. When we ascribe to a social model of disability, we are choosing a mindset that we can make our technology work better for people. We can find ways to improve our technology so that it works well for everyone, not differently for some, not a backdoor entrance for those that we deem edge cases. We want our tech, we want our designs to put the same content, the same information, the same abilities in front of all of our users. But we can't design to accommodate our users' diversity if we don't understand the breadth of that diversity. So who is disabled? Now that we have a better mental model to think about disability, we still need to understand who is disabled by poor design. There are a few broad categories that we can use to think about disability, both in terms of what our design is enabling or disabling, and to help us think of different specific impairments that our users may have. And I want to point out here that even when we discuss impairments such as blindness, in our social model, this is a linguistic shorthand for a quality that some systems are not designed to accommodate. But these categories can be helpful for us. They allow us to think at a higher level about our design. without making dangerous assumptions about what specific impairments we should or shouldn't worry about. So these categories, vision, mobility, speech, hearing, cognition, and neural, are helpful touchstones for us to come back to. Within each category, we can also find a range of impairment. So here are just a few examples of impairments and how they may range in severity. Vision, cataracts, color blindness, full or partial blindness. Mobility can range from a broken wrist to repetitive stress injury to a spinal cord injury. Speech may be impaired by something as simple as a sore throat or a noisy location, or the inability to speak. Hearing, again, may be as simple and temporary as an ear infection or a noisy location, or the user may be deaf or hard of hearing. Cognition may be impaired if you're sleep deprived or if you have a learning disability. And neural impairment can be impacted by things as common as anxiety, depression, and PTSD. For any given website, app, or other technology, some of these conditions can make it more difficult to use that technology. In the most severe cases, poorly designed technology can't be used at all by certain users. So it's time for another imagination exercise. Imagine now breaking both of your wrists or hands, maybe in a traffic accident. How would you continue to use your computer or your mobile phone while in 2 casts on your hands? The good news is that these days, most hardware, phones, laptops, etc., have voice control built in. Siri, Cortana, Hey Google, etc. The bad news is that many of your favorite or essential websites might not work well with that technology. Anyone can become disabled, even temporarily. And although the cast example is pretty easy to see, many disabilities are not visible. Whether or not you realize it, you almost certainly know people who deal with impairments every day. A user who is blind may rely on a screen reader, while a user with cataracts might need to zoom in a great deal. Some users may rely on switches or other technology for extremely restricted mobility. Others might be generally mobile, but unable to control mice well or click small target boxes. And by going through these categories and remembering that each has a diverse range of experiences and abilities, we can be more conscientious about how we design our products. So, why is this important? Hopefully, you agree that it's important because supporting users with both permanent and temporary disabilities is just the right thing to do. But what's the scope? How many people are disabled? According to a 2014 survey from the Social Security Administration, 85.3 million Americans are living with disabilities. That is over 1 in 4 Americans. That does not include people with temporary impairments like broken wrists. It does include people with impairments and restrictions that are classified as severe. About 55.2 million Americans, or 17.6% of the population, had a severe disability at the time of this survey. Has your development team spent years supporting Internet Explorer? Internet Explorer has only 2% global usage. So why are you spending your development hours, I'm assuming that you may be, why prioritize those 2% of global users over the 27% of Americans who have disabilities? We know that not every disability will impact web and technology use, but a significant portion will. 1 in 4 Americans have a disability, and a significant portion of them is a lot of potential and current users. And when we don't consider accessibility in our products, we may be making it difficult or even impossible for that significant portion to access our products. Finally, if product reach isn't enough of a motivator, consider this. The United States has seen a massive uptick in web accessibility lawsuits. For quite a long time, there wasn't a lot of guidance in the law about whether the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, required accommodations on websites and other digital platforms. And if so, to what extent? But since some initial rulings in 2017, and spurred on by the case of Robles versus Domino's Pizza in 2019, a growing number of companies are facing lawsuits and liability risks from inaccessible websites. So is a lawsuit something your company wants to deal with? Hopefully, I've convinced you now that accessibility is really important. It can help a large number of potential users and current users. Many accessibility improvements will make your product better for everyone. On the other hand, ignoring accessibility puts you at a lot of risk. You may be so convinced that you want to make your product accessible right now. You might want to go home and just start researching. And if you do, you're gonna find some plugins. They have exploded in popularity, partly to keep pace with the rise in web accessibility lawsuits. Overlays, helpers, tools that claim that if you add them to your website, they'll handle making it accessible for you. That sounds amazing. Unfortunately, they aren't all they're cracked up to be. I've included a couple of articles in the resources at the very end of this slide deck, but accessibility plugins are, at best, a band-aid over the problem and not a real solution. At worst, they actually cause more confusion for users. There are some things that a plugin simply can't solve, like providing meaningful alt text for images and descriptive text for links. So the second half of this talk is going to cover what you can do to bake accessibility into your product. I'll cover what the most common problems are and how you can audit for them. And if you audit your website and find a ton of problems, you may still decide to use a plugin in the short term while you work on remediation. But I want you to get excited about finding and fixing accessibility yourself, and about building accessible features the first time. Building good testing and development habits is a much more sustainable choice that is going to make you a better developer or designer, and it's going to make your product better and more stable. And like anything else in tech, it's something you can work on incrementally. So let's get started. Web accessibility is not new. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, or WCAG, were first established in 1999, over 20 years ago. Despite this, accessibility has a reputation for being extraordinarily difficult to implement. In fact, building a website or an app is actually extraordinarily difficult. Most people can't do it, but it's something that you can learn. You need to not only learn a programming language, but also the design and the boundaries and expectations of how technology should function. And the same thing is true of accessibility. And just like learning to code or to design or to manage products, you need to understand that you won't go from zero to hero overnight. It takes time to learn, and it takes time to build. But every incremental step that you take, every sprint or cycle, is still adding value to your product. So what's the first step? Like any project, you'll want to identify your product's most critical paths. What do users absolutely need to be able to accomplish? For example, if you're building a restaurant's website, your most critical path is for users to order food online. Targeting the most important user stories will help you create clear goals, make manageable pieces of work, and demonstrate measurable improvements. While targeting your critical paths and beyond, you need to know what to look for. For developers and designers new to accessibility, that might be a mystery. Luckily, the easiest issues to test for are also often the easiest to fix. So while this list I'm about to give you isn't exhaustive, there are a few of the most common problems that every team should be on the lookout for. So let's dive into it now. The first thing I want to talk about is readable text. Make sure that all of your website's text meets minimum contrast thresholds. You can easily test for that. There are built-in tools into a lot of design software. There are a number of color contrast checkers on the web that you can just plug your hex values into, and it'll tell you if it's working or not working. Low contrast text can be really difficult for anyone with poor vision to read. Additionally, another thing is that you want to avoid using only color to identify information or tools, such as links. A startlingly high percentage of the male population globally has some level of color blindness. It affects women as well, but it's really quite common in men. I do not have the exact percentage in this slide though. Also, another thing to keep in mind is to ensure that your text is resizable. If you're practicing responsive design, this is probably true. It's easy to test for though. All you have to do is hold down the Command key and hit the plus button, and you should be able to zoom in on your screen. It's literally the easiest test you can do. So the next thing to cover is text alternatives. And this one's really important. Anything essential to your content that isn't in text needs a text alternative. Every image that conveys important meaning to the user needs alt text. For example, images of products for sale should have descriptive alt text describing them. For example, a gray t-shirt featuring an image of a cute dog from the front. A man 5'4" wearing a size small, gray t-shirt, etc., that sort of thing. And images that don't convey meaning should have empty alt tags. Why? Because without an empty alt tag, which you can see as the second item on my list there, screen readers will just announce the entire file name. For example, you might have to listen to your screen reader read out cute underscore dogs underscore 102919 underscore prod underscore final 2.jpg. And if you have to do that for dozens of images, it's going to get really old really fast. People will just give up and leave. The final thing to keep in mind is that video and audio need text alternatives as well, especially if they are important content on your page. You might want to either include an article that simply repeats what or recaps what is in the video, Or you might want to add transcripts and captions to ensure your content is even better, is adding transcripts and captions to ensure that your media content is easy for everyone to consume. The next thing to cover is descriptive and accessible links and buttons. You're going to want to make sure that all of your interactive elements contain either text or what's called an ARIA label that informs user what that link or button will do. And you can see two different examples on the screen here. The example on the left is a button that does not contain any text inside the content of the button. It contains a high five emoji. So since it doesn't contain text, I've given it an ARIA label. ARIA is, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, but you won't hear anyone call it that. ARIA is a set of attributes that can help to make your HTML more accessible when you use it correctly. So in this case, that is an appropriate use of an ARIA attribute. So a screen reader, when it hits that button, would read out, "High five me." On the right is an example of an interactive element that has a text description, but it's not really meaningful or descriptive. If I'm using a screen reader or a keyboard to navigate quickly through a website and I'm just tabbing through to all of the interactive elements without any context around them, I might hit 6 different links that just read, "Click here," and I don't know what'll happen if I click them. The other thing to keep in mind is that you should prefer semantic HTML whenever possible. There's no reason to use a bunch of divs when something else would make just as much sense or more sense, like an unordered list or a button. It'll save you a lot of time and trouble of adding a bunch of ARIA attributes that are built in under the hood to those semantic HTML elements. Don't make more work for yourself. The next thing that I want to cover is labeling your forms. Forms are typically part of a critical user path. Whether it's a form to sign up or to order a pizza, forms are critical for most sites. Recent design trends, however, have made forms very difficult for some users by removing label elements in favor of other things like placeholder attributes. And while this can be annoying and difficult for honestly any forgetful user, users with memory problems, or simply people who are distracted, screen readers won't announce placeholder attributes at all, leaving users who rely on them totally confused. I know this one seems pretty nitpicky and specific, but it's here because it's become a very, very common problem. So just remember that every form element needs a corresponding label. You can see again on the screen 2 examples. On the left is a good example where there's a label and an input. And on the right is a poor example where an input is only given a placeholder. The next thing to keep in mind is maintaining focus. This one is less of a do and more of a don't. Don't disable focus styles. Disabling focus styles is another weirdly common problem. Again, because of some hot design trend. I get it, a lot of designers don't like glowing blue halos, and I don't blame them. But instead of disabling those styles, redesign them. It's fine to overwrite the default focus styles to something that is consistent across browsers for starters, and you can design something that's more in line with your brand and overall aesthetic. But focus styles are important to keep because they help users with mobility issues, with vision issues, and with cognition issues all keep track of where they are. So don't disable focus styles, don't disable those users. The last major thing I want to cover here is to just be chill. Check your website for flashing or fast animations and movement. A really common one here is auto-playing video banners. You all know what I mean. You visit some highfalutin, fancy, like agency website or something, and I'm not trying to diss on agencies, but you visit some website, and the whole big banner at the top is just an auto-playing video. Well, this kind of content can cause reactions as common as motion sickness and as severe as seizures, especially depending on the content of the video. If the content must stay, try to warn your users, and you must make it easy for them to stop playing the video from playing or the animation. Include a little pause, play, stop, whatever button somewhere in that video that is easily accessible for everyone. Okay, so I just covered a lot of things. I may have left you whirling. Some, or maybe even all of the ideas I just covered may have been new to you. And I know that it can seem really overwhelming, especially when I tell you that those are just some of the most common problems and that there are plenty more. Even more overwhelming can be the thought of trying to audit your product. If you have just one website with only a few pages, maybe it's not so bad. But for folks with really, really big websites, or with multiple websites, or agencies who work on new sites every year, the prospect of manually checking the code for every part of a website can be totally unfeasible. Luckily, there are several tools to help you streamline and even automate parts of accessibility auditing, which I am about to cover. But before I do, I also need to say that none of these tools are sufficient on their own or together. They will make your audits easier and faster, but some manual testing will always be necessary to ensure that your site is really accessible. Linting is the first way that is the first easiest way to start checking your code, especially before they hit production. If you're writing React, I really have to recommend you check out ESLint plugin JSX Ally. This will statically check your JSX elements for you. Regardless of your stack, however, you can also use Pally, which is a command line tool that will audit the code for your entire site when you run it. Another thing I want to talk about is in-browser testing. In-browser testing can automate a lot of checks for you. These tools will find common errors in the rendered page, such as insufficient color contrast, missing alt text, duplicate landmarks, and much more. Two of my favorites are Axe, which is available as a Chrome extension and for Android testing, and Wave, which has a web app, Chrome and Firefox extensions, and API services. And if your team is already incorporating browser-based audits and you really want to level up, you could also think about adding accessibility checks into your unit, integration, and end-to-end tests. Most popular test runners have accessibility packages or tools that you can use to incorporate some automated checks there as well. That may be a great idea for your really large code base, or it may be total overkill for your tiny team. And that's it for automated tests. There is currently only so much that they can do. There is some work being done right now on things like AI suggestions for alt text, but it's very unlikely that we'll ever get to a point where we can fully automate every accessibility test that we need. There are some things that we are just going to need to do ourselves. Tab testing is the first of these. It is manual, but it is fairly low effort. In fact, once you start doing it, you may find that you prefer tabbing for your normal web browsing. Tab testing just involves opening up your site in a browser and hitting the tab key. You should be able to reach every interactive element on the page. That's links, buttons, form elements, etc. You should be able to visually see which element is in focus. That goes back to focus styles. And the order in which you reach those elements should make sense. Take note of any difficulties you experience while doing this so that you can circle back, investigate, and remediate those problems later. Again, missing focus styles are really common, so pay close attention to those. Content analysis can often be overlooked in accessibility recommendations, especially for developers. It can be really easy to just focus on testing and remediating issues that we can just fix in code. But ensuring content accessibility makes a really big difference in supporting users' cognitive and neural diversity. Most of this process has to be manual. Things like ensuring that link text is descriptive. Again, no more click here links. Some of it can be assisted. Writing editors like Hemingway, which is a free tool, and Grammarly, which is freemium, can help your team ensure that your content itself is more accessible and understandable. So tab testing and content analysis are both manual, but again, can both be fairly low effort. They may take time, but they don't require a lot of additional expertise. Screen reader testing, on the other hand, can be very intimidating, especially for people who are just getting started. Every other auditing method that I've covered so far, unlike those, this will require you to learn a new skill. Navigating via screen reader can be tricky for new users to pick up, but understanding how screen reader users experience your product is ultimately invaluable. If you're brand new to accessibility testing, I do recommend just choosing one screen reader software that works on your existing operating system. Get comfortable with one tool and the process of using a screen reader. If you have a team that works on both Windows and Mac, that's great. Maybe each team member can learn one screen reader and then you've diversified your testing. But just remember that testing thoroughly in one program is a lot better than testing poorly in 3. So the most popular screen reader combinations are worth knowing because that's what your users are relying on. NVDA and Firefox or Chrome on Windows is popular, as well as JAWS on Chrome on Windows. And of course, if you're using Mac, the most popular choice is VoiceOver and Safari. If you're testing on mobile, you'll want to use VoiceOver with mobile Safari. If you're testing on Android, you'll want to use TalkBack with mobile Chrome. If you are doing cross-platform mobile apps, that is one situation where you really might want to get familiar with both screen readers. And it's worth noting that all of these screen readers are built-in or free, except for JAWS, which does require an annual license. As you prepare to start testing, the Web AIM Screen Reader Survey can help you understand how people use screen readers. There is a link to that at the end of the slides. And when you do get started, you can use keyboard shortcut cheat sheets to navigate using your keyboard. I still use them every time I open up my screen reader. The process of screen reader testing may uncover behaviors that confuse you. Some behavior may not be what you're expecting, but you might not know if it is what users who regularly rely on screen readers are expecting. And the best way to find that out is by conducting user testing. First of all, user testing isn't free. Please, please, please don't waste your testers' time. Test and remediate smaller issues first. using all of the methods that we've already covered. But yes, user testing. User testing helps you ensure that your project actually works. It's more reliable than any manual or automated test that you can perform. And the larger and more complex your product is, the more important it becomes. And whether you aren't doing any user testing yet at all, or if you already have a robust user research practice, it's important to consider users with disabilities. People who rely on assistive technology every day may catch things that you never even thought of. If you need help recruiting users who rely on assistive technology, there are a few companies that specialize in recruiting users for accessibility testing. Or maybe you already work with a user testing firm that can help you recruit assistive technology users. In any case, you'll need to do your own research to find the right user testing solution for your situation. Like any subject in technology, there's a lot of deep learning and expertise that you can ultimately pursue in web accessibility. Personally, I am still learning a ton. I am far from an expert. I am a developer who thinks that this stuff is important, but I don't get to spend all my time auditing and remediating accessibility issues. I spend most of my time like many of you do. But I'm conscious of accessibility when I write new features. I've been able to integrate linting and in-browser audits into my regular toolkit, and I'm learning to use 2 screen readers. As you continue to learn about web accessibility, it's important to remember that this isn't the Wild West. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines were established over 20 years ago, and they were updated as recently as 2018. A draft for the latest updates was released in August of this year. The documentation can be intimidating to read, but it's important to remember that there are guidelines, expected behavior, and testable practices. This resource and others are available to help you. You can do it. The WCAG is complicated. The guidelines are complicated. There's a lot in there because tech is complicated. But that's what makes it so powerful. Whatever your product is, whether it's an app or a program or a website, I bet it's powerful. It's doing something amazing to make people's lives better or easier, something that we could only dream about 20 or 30 years ago. And you've worked hard to make it the best that it can be and to reach as many people as possible. So don't let old code and passing design trends disable your users. Make sure that your product is enabling your users, all of them. Make your slice of the internet, make sure it's really built for everyone. Thank you. That is the end of my presentation. I do have a few more slides here that are going through some of my favorite resources, things like places you can learn more, guidelines, helpful tools, resources specifically for designers, browser testing tools, screen readers, courses if you really want to dive in, and if you are curious or concerned about the rise of popularity in plugins, I have some links about that. You can find these slides and these links on my website, which is kattow.dev. That's KATTOW.dev. And you can find that on my speaking page. Thank you all so much.